Okay, sorry about that. Am I visible and audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, start my speech in a bit. Starting my speech in 3. Oh yeah, before that, POI is in chat. If I don't take 1/5, I'll prompt you for one. So just don't badger me. No preferred gender pronouns. 3, 2, 1. Panel, charities are an important entity. But the very fact that in status quo, that ineffective and problematic charities get away with tax breaks on the sole reason that they are a charity is a problem in of itself. 3 pieces of framing before I move on to my substantives. Firstly, panel, it's important to understand that this debate assumes that there is an objective standard to determine effectiveness. But even if there isn't, we'll be charitable and we'll explain what these objective standards look like. Because it is important to note, panel, that every charity organization have their own visions and end goals. And yeah, right? So for example, for an orphanage, it would be like housing a specific amount of individuals or making sure that by this particular year or this particular month, we have people have taken these children or something like that, right? So for cancer organizations, this can look like how many individuals you help in alleviating or assisting in their suffering. In all of this panel, charity organizations have a roadmap. This can look like steps that they need to take in order to achieve these goals. It can look like marketing. It can look like connections with legal or local agencies, right? It can look like how consistently are you pumping in money into this organization. If sometimes you give less, sometimes you give more, that might affect you. And it's also how tangible and objective these steps are, right? So based on all of this, what can this effectiveness look like? I think we will basically set up an effectiveness index that make sure that organizations, charity organizations, are keeping up to these steps that they are promising, right? So basically, visualize it as a checklist. The more boxes they tick in our world, the higher that they rank on this index. So for example, if they have no roadmap in status quo, I think what we can do is obligate them to have a roadmap to show us what they actually plan. But next thing, panel, is that there are other weighing factors that we can take into account inside government. Things like how difficult it is for a charity organization to fulfill its particular goals. So for example, in the fight against cancer, we can't expect them to like cure cancer overnight. So I think we can adjust metrics subjective to the goals and determine based on that. Based on all of this, then I think what we can create is a ranking system where if you are the highest rank in this particular ranking system, then you would probably pay little to no taxes. But if you're the lowest rank, you would probably be paying the similar amount of taxes. And we'll release a database that is accessible to the general public based on all the information that we have gathered. What is the position then on government? I think we'll prove to you simply that this mechanism firstly gives proportionate tax breaks to charity, but secondly and more importantly, keeps them accountable and prevents negligence. The first argument then, panel, is why is the system or why is this mechanism justified? Understand, panel, that in status quo, there's an absolute metric that is set, which means all charity organizations get this tax break regardless of whether or not they're effective or ineffective or whatever. The principle, however, panel, that's important behind a tax break, the reason why governments give tax breaks in the first place is because these organizations are supposed to be helping and doing a net good for society. The very fact that you're non-profit means that you're supposed to be helping people and assisting people because that's what the sole purpose of this particular tax break is for, right? But the second thing here to note, panel, the first prong to the argument is that a lot of charities don't do a lot of net good. This can look like a few things. Firstly, on privileged individuals. The first prong to this is on tax avoidance. A lot of privileged individuals set up charity organizations on the sole purpose that they want to avoid tax. So they pump a lot of money into these charity organizations and mask it as something that's helping individuals when it's doing nothing in status quo. But it's important to note that this problem is symmetrical in both worlds. But what's important or what we can do better in our world, at least even if it's for the purpose of tax avoidance, these charities are still doing a net benefit. But secondly, panel, on this same prong, is that the oftentimes privileged individuals who are big and powerful and who are problematic want to deflect a lot of this blame or deflect a lot of problems that they're accused of. This can look like Jeffrey Epstein setting up a charity organization for those who were sexually assaulted when he is literally a sexual predator and has assaulted multiple women. Therefore, they don't get tax as a result of this. This is a problem. But second prong to this panel is that sometimes charities are just not good enough. They just slack, right? This can look like them eating up welfare checks from the government, getting tax breaks from the government, but are abusive in their orphanages, do all these bad things in their charities, slacking in their operations, right? This is a problem because they're supposed to be helping people, and if they don't, then it's principally justified to take away this ability. The comparative is here, panel, is that it's important to stick to this principle because the very fact is the government is benefiting you in a way that it expects you to benefit people because you technically are doing a favor for the government. That's why you're getting this tax break. If you're not fulfilling this particular favor, then I think it's justified to take away this benefit. Yes, POI.
Who sets this universal checklist that all charities now have to somehow follow?
No, the charities can propose a roadmap, and I think this will incentivize them to have like a clear roadmap on what they want to achieve. And like we can determine as the government if this roadmap is tangible and objective. So it's up to the charities to decide what they want it to look like, and then we will decide based on objective metrics that we have. Second argument then, why is this an incentive structure for people and organizations? The first thing is money, panel. Charities need money, and the very fact is tax break help them get as much money as possible. When you have high taxes on a charity organization, this incapacitates your ability to do any sort of benefit or help society in any way. So OP can say, what if the charity can't meet these steps because they have no money? The first response here, panel, is that there's not just money, right? It's like your roadmap, it's like your outreach, things like that. So these things are important to note. But even if it's just money, panel, and this charity organization is one that is poor and can't do any benefit, I think we'll bite the bullet and say we are okay with these charity organizations closing down. Second prong to this panel is on credibility and PR. Understand that now there is a database. So what does this incentivize? Firstly, on rich people, they care about the credibility and PR because it affects how much I don't know how much they're valued at whatever their companies, etc. Right? Understand that now rich people with charity organizations will be more incentivized to pump money into their charities in a more effective manner. But secondly, on the database, right? Because understand that this database will show all charities that are doing good or doing badly. So even if you're a small charity and you're paying a lot of taxes, at least people can see now that, oh, this is an issue that I care about. Therefore, even in our worst case, we make it more accessible for individuals to identify charity organizations that need help, therefore resulting in greater incentive. The third prong to this panel is on people. Understand that the rationale behind donating is that you're doing a net good for society. And the very fact is, in status quo, there is no transparency behind how much you're actually donating or how much effectiveness is this donating going to do. When we create this database and this ranking system is accessible to everyone, I think people can see and identify which are the charities that are actually being effective. Therefore, they can sort out accordingly on which charity organizations they want to prioritize. This is important and justified, panel, because the very fact that people donate to your organization means they care about you. If they care about you, you need to be doing something to return that same level of care. The impact of this panel is that we prevent big, powerful charities or big, powerful individuals from creating a facade to paint themselves as the good guys in this when they're actually the bad guys and not doing any benefit for society whatsoever. We take this debate.
Thank you for that speech. Now I invite the Leader of Opposition here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Give me a sec. I will also take POIs in chat. Sorry. Wait, sorry. Can I take it back? I said verbally just now, but I now prefer them in chat. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, it applies to the yellow too. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, did I hear them wrongly? Because first they tell you charities are bad and suck up government funds, and in the same breath, somehow claim that charities get to make their own roadmap to decide how much of a tax break they get. What this means to say is all of the negative harms, like they tell you about why charities are bad, they're exploitative, they waste government resources. Jeffrey Epstein has a charity and he sexually assaults women. They are now giving the power to Jeffrey Epstein to decide how effective his charity is. This mechanization coming outside government makes absolutely no sense, because even if we buy them at their mechanization, they're allowing these people to decide how much tax breaks to give them in the first place. So we think this debate has to occur in a way of some sort of regulation exists, right? So we think the mechanization in this debate is simply that they have to come up with a universal set of metrics to decide every single charity on how effective they are. And we tell you how effective the effectiveness metrics would likely be up to politicians, legislators, and like people who make law in the first place, and like mediate tax, right? We tell you the big charities in status quo looks like UNESCO and UNICEF, and small charities are unable to make change simply because they have no finances, the lack of popularity, and no manpower. So all of their ability is like very centralized, and it doesn't gain a lot of impact pretty much. We tell you that small charities in our world looks like young adults, local to cities, grassroots movements, like catering to localized issues instead of dealing with whole countries like UNESCO and UNICEF, right? We think tax breaks should be decided by legislators and politicians because somehow the mechanization suggests that all of these companies get to decide how much tax to give themselves without any regulation. The trade we're willing to make is benefiting big charities a bit less to ensure the survivability of small charities. 3 things I'll do for you in my speech. First, tell you how the effectiveness of charities and the measure of it is first vague and pernicious. Second, I'll tell you in my speech why small charities are absolutely necessary to the world we live in. And 3, why small charities will die out in their world. We told you how big charities already have a lot of money, finances, support, so they're unlikely to be affected too much by like a tax break being even, which is our world that we're proposing. Either everyone gets a tax break or no one gets a tax break, right? Every charity would be taxed the same. So this debate then doesn't become about big charities anymore. They have to defend how small charities will continue to thrive in a system where these small charities are unable to meet the same efficiency and effectivity standards set by people in power. My first argument deals with the effectiveness of charities, which are vague and pernicious, right? We can't let charities make their own roadmap. So who sets the parameters? We say that politicians and legislators set the parameters. Why is this harmful? Charities, especially big ones, as conceded inside government, already told us why these people use it as a way to launder money. So especially big charities are used to launder money anyways. So now we have to regulate these charities, and somehow the regulation will come back to these politicians and legislators. So why is this harmful and what does this look like? 3 levels. The first level, effectiveness will be very tilted towards the big charities because small charities aren't able to meet the same roadmap that you are giving to every single charity to prove. Because the moment in which you say it's subjective, this system of like effectiveness doesn't work because it has to apply to every single charity, but their alternative is somehow to let these charities decide on their own how effective they are. Second, we tell you this is harmful because these metrics are very likely to be vague as a way to launder their money easier. And third, we say that even in their best case, there's no significant increase in utility to these big corporations. Sure, they might have some more money to help, but they're already helping people on such a big scale. And that's why this debate isn't about the big charities, because they are likely to exist in both worlds either way. A charity needs to do good, right? So my question then becomes, why does one group value more than the other? Like, why would you rank, say, helping a minority of like a whole minority race instead of helping a small group of women? Why is that better? And then the question becomes, who decides why should legislators decide why one thing is more valuable than the other, and why do their opinions matter? We tell you they already have harmful vested interests and they have no on-the-ground experience for these small people, meaning to say they're unlikely to make very effective standards of like measuring effectiveness anyways, even if they are somehow benevolent, right? So we told you how our proposes the counterfactual of being simply neutral to everybody and letting small charities survive. Second, about why small charities are absolutely necessary to the world we live in today. We told you how big charities are only likely to tackle wide-scale issues, global issues, international issues. 3 reasons to this. First, media coverage. They need to justify their funding. So if they're likely to choose to helping out like kids in Afghanistan versus helping a certain proportion of women in a country get like sanitary pads, they're likely to go for the kids in Afghanistan. But we already told you how the big charities will be symmetrical in both worlds. So this becomes a debate about the small charities. They need publicity. They get good publicity when they solve the big problems, and there's high level of bureaucracy when it comes to these people, right? So why are small charities necessary? First, small charities cater to actual minorities, like the Orang Asli in a small country. We talk about like small villages that exist, which won't actually gain the attention from UNESCO or UNICEF, right? Because it's simply not worth these big charities' time. Small groups have no way to contact UNICEF, and even if they do, they like go find internet, drop like a small email. What are the chances UNICEF comes to help them? Right? Third, we tell why small charities are better. Even we talk about personal connections and more targeted policies that represent the whole community because they're in the community itself. They know the struggles instead of a huge foreign international charity coming into a country and deciding what's best for you. Why does this argument matter? First, like you have to help these small charities, and their side has no help to these small charities, which tackles small but still very important issues. Please contend with that in your second speech. My third argument then deals with why these charities will eventually die out, and let's take them at their best, even if your checklist can be somehow accurate and like individual to, not accurate and like universal to every single charity, right? We tell you first that small charities are unknown, meaning they have no social or political traction to go past like a lot of things. That's why a lot of small charities die out and they have less support. Oh, sorry, I missed your POI, I'm so sorry. Second, we tell you why small charities have no steady income and they rely on public funding. And we tell you how small charities have no manpower. This matters, right? Because small charities, when they don't have all of these things, they're unlikely to be voted in as effective because they cannot be effective compared to the bigger charities, which are doing like huge things to the world, right? Do huge benefits. But since benefits exist on both sides, we tell you this is extremely harmful now because these people will look inefficient and taxed very high or given no tax breaks, right? Small charities will now be seen as inefficient in your world because no small charities can contend with the big charities. Tax breaks means publicizing how efficient you are based on a system of checklists. So if people want to support a charity and do the research like you say they claim they would see, oh, they didn't check off any of these things. So they are likely to be inefficient. And you validate the claims of inefficiency of these small charities when it wasn't even their fault in the first place. They can't do as much as big charities. We told you in my speech why like the effectiveness is pernicious and vague. We told you why small charities are necessary and why small charities will die out in your side. Please.
I invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Can I confirm I'm visible and audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judge, this debate needs to be one of weighing. Perhaps it is true that maybe small charities will be disadvantaged through our mechanism, but we need to deal how exactly they are going to fare off in the counterfactual under their world, where there are probably small charities that are unknown, that probably don't have money to fund them in the first place. How exactly will they have any mechanistic change to help them? But more importantly, even if we trade them off, the bigger picture here is how are we able to introspect into individual charities and call out the abusive practices like negligence, the fact that elites can wash off their money to offset the really horrible things that we can do. If we're able to channel and say they're ineffective, that's principally in line with what charities are supposed to do, and that's in progress of what a net good that we create in society. So we need to weigh out the bigger picture, and I explain all of this in 3 questions. Firstly, how does our mechanism look like, since there's a big confusion and misinterpretation by their side? Secondly, how do we benefit small charities just to engage with their side? And thirdly, how do we create a net good? And I'll prove to you a rational weighing metric as to why this outweighs the small charities, even in the worst case. Firstly, how does our mechanism look like? I think there were 2 faulty interpretations of our case. What we said is that charities are the ones that dictate their roadmap. It's not legislators and politicians. They gave us no analysis to why that's the case. They just asserted it and assumed that's our case. This is because, or the reason why our characterization is true is because that is status quo. Every single entrenchment of a charity organization already has codified visions and missions and goals that they want to achieve, and oftentimes they have a roadmap to achieve that. If they don't have a roadmap, just create a roadmap. And that's why we create better accountability for them to have an incentive to create a step of what are they going to take. We think that's a far better world because we're able to actually see what are the general steps that charity organizations should take in order to reach that goal. And I think that's far better because we can see they're actually meeting those steps or not to qualify for them to be an effective charity to begin with. But the second thing to note was they somehow assume that corporations can suddenly determine the tax breaks on their own volition. That's not true. That's what we're fighting for. They're assuming that every time a charity organization shows your roadmap, you can automatically qualify for the tax break that you want. Wrong. Government agencies and governments in power can check whether or not, firstly, these roadmaps are legitimate. Secondly, check reports as to whether or not you're meeting the steps. And thirdly, will decide whether or not you qualify for the tax breaks depending on whether or not you effectively meet those steps. So all the misinterpretations is wrong, and the impact of that was they were never really clashing with our case on that regard. Why is this crucial and why were we consistent with our case? We characterize to you big problems like Jeffrey Epstein, for instance, creating very charity organizations to offset the abusive practices that they do. What's the delta in our world? In our world, when we measure the charity organizations that Jeffrey Epstein created, we can draw back as to how he's actively encouraging or touching underage women and engaging in sex trafficking. That is enough onus for us to prove that he's detracting from the very objective of the charity organization. So those are grounds for us to say your charity organization is ineffective because your actor or your donor is actively causing the exact opposite in other forms of backgrounds or demographics. So the introspection is something we're able to create, call out the level of exploitation and not give them proportional amount of tax breaks there. So the reformation, the rectification is something that we have in our world. If you're abusive, if you're negligent, you don't care about the children that are taking care of orphanage, that is when we say we won't give you the amount of tax breaks that you want, we probably tax you that much higher. This is crucial because most charity organizations, as alluded before, finders on the premise of money. So if you don't have money or we tax you more, that's incentive structure for you to be able to change your ways to get those steps to be met in order for you to qualify for better tax breaks that are more favorable to you. I think there is no incentive on the counterfactual. You have no analysis to why big exploitative or abusive or negligent charity organizations are able to reform their ways, especially since they can hide under reputation and credibility to get continuous funding from people rather than other charities that actually do a genuine cause. We need to go back to the fundamental principles of what these charity organizations are. They're doing a net good. That's why it's in line with our principle. They were dismissive. Secondly, how do you have small charities? The first thing I want to note here is we don't automatically discount a small charity at a point in which we have these guidelines and mechanistic change. Why is this the case? When we told you in our framing that in the event that you probably a cause that has a long-term change, for instance, you're a charity organization that wants to fund for cancer. Of course, our metric is not you have to find a cure to cancer overnight. We understand and we might have weighing metrics that change according to how difficult your goal is. But the point we're making is if you effectively meet your steps, that means even if you're a poor charity that does not have money, are you going out to the streets and telling people and campaigning as a result of that? If you're not doing any of those steps, you're not meeting the checklist, and we think you're ineffective in that regard. But if you're poor and you're meeting the check, you are still effective and you can still qualify for favorable tax breaks. But secondly, we can have equitable allocation in our world, and that's the crucial delta in our debate. If we have tax breaks to charity organizations according to how effective, the tax revenue that we can get can be equitably allocated to all charities. So at least there is some money going to small charities that are not famous, not popular, people don't know about that, or people don't care about minority causes. At least we equitably allocate. Rather in your world, when they're small, helping Ora Asli, no one donate. What's your mechanistic change there? But thirdly, in the worst case, let's say you're a small charity and for far too long you're not meeting your end goals, then probably it's a lost cause judge. I don't understand why that argument to say that if a charity organization is not functioning, not meeting its goals, it's a lost cause and it probably shouldn't be established. Maybe there's better ways to pursue this by activism, for instance. So I think it's better than letting them deteriorate to a point in no return where they get tax breaks but not doing a cause. I'll take a 6. It's already 6, but go for the POI. Go for it.
How do you want your roadmap to be validated by regulators who you claim are using charities to evade tax?
The governments are not evading tax. It's the elites and the powerful are probably evading tax under that regard. I don't see as to why the governments would be not objective under that regard because it's two different separate entities. So the best case is at least there's some mechanistic change as to how we help small charities under our world rather than the counterfactual that they characterize are poor, helping minority causes, no change there. But lastly, on net good, here's where I do a weighing. Judge, if you're able to show many charity organizations, even international organizations, that complacently get money as a result of their reputation, credibility, but don't fix the actual issues for the minorities or the people they stood to protect, that's a net negative towards the charities. At least in our world, through our introspection, we're able to hold them accountable and say, if you want the money, you better do a net good. That means on a collective, more charities in our world are able to actually compromise or do what they're actually supposed to do. And I would argue that's a fair, more equitable world that actually helps minorities rather than being ignorant under the world of opposition. Extremely proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Now I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Hi, I'm audible and visible, right? POIs in chat, pronunciation. Okay, starting speech in 3, 2, I think that side government has had a very strange case coming up to us today, right? Because number one, here's the two layers to their metric of deciding how efficient or like how efficacy is measured in their charities today, right? Number one, they say that charities themselves set out a checklist via a roadmap, and number two, the government agency will then check if they fulfill the checklist, and then therefore tax brackets are coming in. Opposition's reply to this is number one, how are you going to trust the charities which you yourself characterize as malicious in itself to set up a fair roadmap for themselves, right? I can say that like if you want to argue that like these charities are already like complacent and like don't fulfill their roadmap, I think that the point at which you ask them to provide a roadmap, they will just simply change the roadmap so that they can fulfill it and set the bar as low as possible. Second, when they talk about the check and balance agency being the government, and then in the same breath tell us that the government is not who is like evading tax, it's the wealthy and powerful. Understand that number one, the standards that are set by the government for tax breaks are necessarily created by legislators, people in parliament, which are naturally the people who are wealthy and powerful, or even if they're not people who are wealthy and powerful, at least have connections to people who are wealthy and powerful. Your metric doesn't work because it allows for multiple instances of abuses, and also it's extremely flip-flopping, right? On one second you tell us that the debate needs to take place in an objective metric, and then you proceed to tell us that there is no such objective metric, and that you need to allow some sort of like subjective scale onto like big charities and then small charities. I think that this inconsistency has come from PM and clients continue with DPM. I don't think they should take the win just based on that, their mischaracterization alone, right? But okay, what is the debate today, right? I think that side government has to provide, if you want to debate today, you have to provide to us what is the objective metric. And very simply put, no matter on which side you are on, you're probably going to agree that the charity that helps the most people is the most objective charity, right? And henceforth, charities that help the most people would therefore get the largest amount of tax break, and that is like naturally the natural progression of both sides, like analysis on what is the metric, right? So why exactly is it that this still harms small charities under their side, right? Because number one, as the previous speaker has mentioned, big charities naturally have more capacity to act, right? They can help a larger amount of people. They can go into like places like war zones and stuff, and like try to help the most like extremely impoverished people. What small charities do is that they are more localized, more focused, right? This includes like providing sanitary pads for like rural communities. This looks like trying to help individuals who are like who are living in extremely like places that are like extremely hard to reach, and like providing them with like electronics, or providing them with like clothing, food, or like helping poor people, the urban poor. I think that these are also important causes that naturally get drawn out on their side, because understand that the metric today, if you want to set the metric today as how many people you can help, that number one, I think that it manifests that like big charities will always help more people than small charities. Therefore, you give big charities the largest amount of tax breaks, and small charities get an increased amount of tax break. They get a significantly decreased amount of tax breaks, right? Meaning that these small charities are more harmed, right? Because of the fact that they themselves are less efficient. But even if you take them at their like weird metric, I still think it doesn't work, because number one, small charities do not have anyone to advocate for them on the government level. So henceforth, your second layer of like defense is going to be extremely biased against them. But also number two, sometimes they fail to fulfill their own roadmaps because naturally they depend on the goodwill of the people, and they naturally depend on the goodwill of like investors, and there are many circumstantial places wherein they cannot move to the fastest efficiency that they can achieve. Therefore, you are more likely to harm the lowest common denominator, which are the small charities, than the big charities. Why is that particularly bad? Because number one, by harming small charities, you inevitably harm the smallest minority that they cater to, right? We're looking at women, we're looking at minorities in countries who are socially conservative, we're looking at indigenous individuals who cannot have access to all of the privileges of modern life. I think that this is the largest harm that they need to bite the bullet on and explain to us why it's fine to take, right? Because of the fact that when you restrict the ability and the capacity for these charities to act, that is the point at which you actively harm these communities and tell them their causes matter less than whatever it is that the big charities are busy doing. Now, they have a mechanism for trying to fix this, right? They say that, these small charities will get more publicity. I think this came at PM stage. These charities will get more publicity because they naturally pay more tax. I don't understand the mechanic, right? Who the hell looks through like past tax records to decide which charity you want to donate to, right? I just don't think that's logical. I think that the way charities reach people is through marketing, is by like showing what they've done, and ultimately on both ends, small charities have less capacity to act than large charities. let's take them at their best, even under their own mechanism, their own case. They tell to us that part of their own like metric onto which you decide how charities are valued is by how well connected you are to other charities, how much capacity you have to act. And ultimately, these are all things that only help big charities. So what is the comparative? They keep pushing us for this. I think like my previous speaker has given it to you, but I'll give it to you again, right? Under their side, you do not change the paradigm of big charities dominating. In fact, you give them a larger amount of tax rate because of the fact that now under your metrics, they have fully earned it, right? So their exclusive harm is that they harm small charities who are already cash-strapped, who are already at a lower capacity, who already cannot act as much as the big charities. What is it on our side, right? When we propose a flag, today's debate is not about which side does more good. It's like which side does less harm. They do more harm than us. Henceforth, we should win. Why is it that we should win? Because of the fact that on our side, small charities have a less taxes to pay. On our side, at the very least, small charities are not expected to fulfill to the standards that these big charities will necessarily trickle down to them. At the end of the day, we need to prove we cannot argue for charities being placed on these sort of metrics because of the fact that these metrics aren't capable of being objective, and even if they are still going to harm the smallest possible people. And on that, why? Okay, yeah. On that, so why exactly is it that these small minorities are important? Because understand these small minorities are individuals that are often overlooked by big charities, right? What does that look like on our world when you give big charities tax break? I think that the continuous harm thing will still continue on their side. But even if all the harms do not necessarily manifest and all, at the very least on our side, we still ensure that small charities can survive, have a way to survive. I don't think they've given us any mechanization how that happens. That rests my case.
Thank you for that speech. Now I invite the government whip to end the substantive motion for Gov. Here.
Okay, I prefer POIs in the chat. I'll take you around 5 minutes. Starting in 3, 2, 1. One question I'm going to answer in my speech: which side makes charities better? 3 levels to this. Firstly, on negligence. Secondly, on accountability. And thirdly, on small charities. Firstly, I want to preface all these levels by talking about something called government fiat. This motion assumes some level of feasibility as to how our mechanism works. And this is important because a lot of the opposition's attack has been on our mechanism, right? I don't think even if it's just not fiat, this is a value judgment debate. So I don't see why a lot of their attacks on us would necessarily fly, right? Okay, moving on to the question, which side makes charities better? Firstly, on negligence, I want to note that opposition had very little response to our ideas about how a lot of charities are negligent or complacent in the way they help people, right? Not only are they hurting people in the worst instances where orphanages don't provide enough housing or funding for the children that they house. They're also charities that just don't do enough, right? They're just sitting on funds. They're not effectively producing output that actually impacts the communities that they actually do. And we premise this on the idea that these charities respond to money in the sense that if they have to pay more taxes, there's more of an incentive to be better. And this is the problem that we've highlighted throughout our 2 entire speeches. I think necessarily we win this particular clash of just making charities more effective because very little response to argument stands at the end of the debate. Second part on accountability and holding charities accountable to standards. Opposition tells us that these charities are unlikely to be held accountable because legislators have a vested interest. I think this is premised on the idea that legislators can act on this vested interest to perhaps place a charity on a higher rank and give them more of a tax break, right? I think firstly, I'm making the best version of this argument for them because there's very little analysis of how this vested interest works. I'm looking forward to hearing that from opposition whip. But I think secondly, our mechanism takes out a lot of this, right? Because necessarily our mechanism requires a higher level of visibility that opposition cannot access. To this extent, a lot of the visibility carries upon public accountability, or even just an inability to lie on public record, right? For all these reasons, I don't think this vested interest will be one that's necessarily or is great to the extent that opposition talks about. But I think thirdly and more importantly, there are going to be competing interests between legislators. I don't think this debate operates in a world where there's only like legislators from one particular government. I think in that instance, the competing interests will necessarily balance these very harmful incentive that opposition assumes there, right? But fourthly, I don't really see why this vested interest actually works in favor of a legislator, right? Because if they want to place a charity at a higher level, what is their incentive to do that? They don't get much benefit from them. The most they get is just maybe they can help a friend out. I don't see how that outweighs a lot of the like the mechanism of visibility that exists in outside the house, and why that necessarily why a legislator would take the incentive to do this. So I think that conclusion and the 4 levels of responses I gave you just prove why that is highly unlikely. But even if these legislators can act on this vested interest and favor some charities over another, I think this is a net good, right? Because at least this means that if it is true that this charity is one that possibly has connections with the government, this net good means that they are less likely to be negligent in the way they help people, right? So at least they still qualify for some level of tax break, but at least ensure there's more of an incentive for this charity to reduce their negligence, to actually show that they justify getting this tax break. I think on opposition as well, there's still some charities that are going to be favored by legislators. Perhaps these charities are going to be publicized to a greater extent. Perhaps legislators will back charities. Perhaps they will attend events to promote these charities. But on our side, they actually have to do something to back up and justify getting a higher tax break, right? Their response to this was just, under this level of argumentation, was just to suggest that charities would set their own roadmaps, adjust accordingly. So it's like an inflated idea or like a facade that they're actually being effective. I think in that regard, the government works in, like our mechanism works in favor of us, right? Because we told you how in that instance, like a government would have to necessarily green light this type of roadmaps and effectiveness. That to that extent as well, if your roadmap is something that is necessarily not going to help as many people, I don't think you're going to attract a large number of donors to begin with. I don't think charities have an incentive to portray a facade and not actually try to benefit the community that they're trying to do. The reason why we win this clash is firstly on like slightly more certainty, right? I don't think there's much certainty that legislators would necessarily try to favor one charity over another. I don't think it's much or at least guarantee that this would work. At least on our side, there's slightly more of a guarantee that charities would have to reduce their negligence, reduce sitting on funds and not doing much, or delaying a lot of their community outreach. To that extent, we take that particular clash. But thirdly, on small charities, I want to preface this by saying that opposition tries and does not really do a good job in framing out big charities. I think this is problematic, right? Because big charities are a large part of this debate. If they want to talk about legislators having vested interests, this necessarily affects charities that are, being negligent in nature, that are sitting on money. Like for example, like charities that are set up by Silicon Valley like investors that set up charities for the purpose of donating and getting tax breaks. To that extent, big charities are a big part of this debate. They have very little response to analysis about how we hold them accountable because they now actually have to do something, right? Opposition's main idea, before that I'll take a PY.
When smaller charities get smaller tax breaks, you're actively calling them out to be ineffective. How do they survive?
Okay, I'm just getting to that. Okay, opposition tells you that these small charities die out because they're less likely to be ineffective, they have barriers, etc., etc. I think Cohen already dealt to this to some extent when they told you about how there's an equitable stream back of revenue from the taxes that we get from these charities. But secondly, right, in regards to like barriers of how a small charity works, I think to that extent, the scale of how effective a small charity can be isn't necessarily numerical in nature. If a niche or small charity is only likely going to help minorities, they don't need as much money to begin with. They don't need as much funding to begin with. They probably don't help as much people because that's minorities, right? A small group of people. So to that extent, adjusting effectiveness to different charities is something that works in our side. But even if small charities die out, our side is still one that is preferable, because if it means that this charity isn't able to do much, perhaps there requires a change. If your charity is losing out on is losing out so much money from not qualifying for a large amount of tax, and I know this sounds a bit bad, but just bear with me. If they're losing out a lot of money from taxes, right? Perhaps these charities are not ones that are actually help minorities. I think on our side, we're more likely to have an overturn of these charities that are ineffective, and at least ensure that there's some incentive to create that change, because the need and the desire is there. It's just who is able to be more effective in doing so. I think we win that particular clash, even if we lose out in the worst case, small charities. We take the debate. Vote government.
Thank you for that speech. To end the substantive portion of this debate, I invite the opposition whip here.
Hi, I just want to test, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, give me a few moments. I'll be starting my speech, pure eyes in the chat. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand that Thai government today has already lost the debate when they provided us a really, really uncharitable mechanism that literally only works conveniently on their side of the case. How can they come up to us and tell us that this metric is number one, universal and objective, but also at the same time, these kinds of mechanisms provide these kinds of roadmaps that illustrate the idea that these kinds of charity then can, create these kind of roadmaps based on their own idea of what kind of efficiency that they want to achieve at the end of the day. And after that, they also tell us that, well, but that's okay because after that we have government agencies to back up, but also consider the fact that this kind of government agency can be also corrupt in the first place, meaning the whole entire case and set out a mechanism that wants to come up from side government today is literally illogical and does not provide any sort of trade-off in today's debate. Now, first, a few rebuttals to a side government. Before I move on to our why we want today's debate, right? So first, understand that, okay, so side government wants to tell us and say that, well, at the end of the day, this is a value judgment debate. Okay, fine. Let's say we be charitable to the side government, even though the mechanism that they want to push on and their entire case is literally contingent upon whether the mechanism actually works or not. Let's take their best case. Okay, let's say even if the mechanism works, okay, let's say if the mechanism doesn't exist and you actually can, measure things based on efficiency. Understand that in a social work industry, the idea of efficiency definitely then links to you being able to help more people. Understand that we side opposition has provided you the extended analysis and illustration as to why comparatively big charities definitely will help more people as opposed to small charities. Why? Because big charities have more supporters than small charities. Big charities have more exposure compared to small charities. Meaning, if you really want to take away these kinds of mechanism and just judge these kinds of people based on like the efficiency, which is what side government wants us to do because they claim that it's a value judgment debate. Understand that at the end of the day, these kinds of efficiency, degree of efficiency, big charities still take it home. Meaning, you still then paint these kinds of perception in which the big charities are much more efficient. Meaning, because of the nature of small charities that help lesser people and obviously the less media coverage and less media exposure of these small charities. Meaning, at the end of the day, you are still harming these kinds of small charities at the end of the day because these small charities will definitely be less efficient at the end of the day. And next, they also want to talk about how and even if the mechanism works, it is still much more advantageous to these kinds of big charities. Why? Because both sides already concede to the fact that big charities are usually backed up by these kinds of major rich corporations and sponsorships that are usually sponsoring these kinds of big charities. Meaning, when you actually provide this kind of mechanism whereby the more efficient a charity is, which we have already painted you an illustration as to why these kinds of big charities are likely to be more efficient and they can get more tax breaks at the end of the day. Understand that what happens at the end of the day is that these kinds of sponsorship and these kinds of corporations are likely to have these kinds of self-interest incentive to actually then want to, manipulate the kind of efficiency that's actually happening within the premise of these kinds of big charities, right? So next, they also want to talk about the whole idea of negligence that comes from these kinds of big charities, which they believe that their mechanism can help to rat out these kinds of negligence that's occurring within the big charities. Number one, law and regulation already exists. And if you want to argue that no, law and regulation doesn't help because corruption exists within the law, hey, but then you also provided us your backup mechanism, which is saying that, oh, this government agency then also will then look through these kinds of roadmaps. You cannot claim these kinds of two contradictory imageries together in your case. Next, they also wanted to tell you that these kinds of roadmaps shouldn't also be the metric to fish out these kind of negligence in the first place, because we've already told you today's debate isn't about which side is better, rather which side actually causes lesser harm. And we've already told you all the harms that actually comes from all the harms that comes out enacting these kinds of policy, whereby you actually measure the tax breaks based on the efficiency, because we've already told you the idea of efficiency in itself is already disproportionately harmful towards these kinds of small charities. And understand that, because when you want to use this kind of mechanism, when you use this roadmap to fish out negligence, understand that these kind of charities where are already performing this kind of negligence, will then likely fit it to their own framework. And because negligence is something that obviously when you want to fish out negligence in the first place, you don't know that the negligence is actually happening in the first place. Therefore, they're likely to then create these kinds of facade in these kinds of roadmap that they want to produce to these kinds of government agencies. Therefore, where is the actual check and balance, and where is the actual accountability that can actually occur on your side of the case? Next, understand that big charities, when they are occurring under negligence, one thing that actually really holds them accountable at the end of the day is their supporters. Other than these kind of big charities, they usually thrive and survive through public fund. They thrive through public support, media coverage. So naturally, when these kinds of big charities have, for a period of time, haven't done really any sort of charity work, understand that obviously at the end of the day, they're going to lose support. And that's where the actual accountability comes from, in which it's more likely to occur on which is already symmetrical on both sides, and in which your mechanism actually doesn't really work at the end of the day. Now, what have we told you today? We have told you that, number one, the illustration of the fact that these kinds of policy that you want to enact, whether you provide more tax breaks to charities that are more efficient, number one, is extremely harmful to these kinds of small charities. Why? Because we have already told you that these kinds of small charities are necessary. Why? Because they provide these kinds of help to people on the ground, people who actually need help, people who are less likely to actually get help from, number one, the government, and number two, big charities. Understand that the reason why it is necessary for these kinds of small charities to survive, it's because we then actually encourage these kinds of small charities, which are more likely to be from grassroots movements, students, or youth leaders, in which then they can expand their sort of humanitarian efforts and work in the first place. The implications of you enacting these kinds of tax breaks based on efficiency is going to be really demotivating and discouraging to these kinds of small charities, because understanding the fact that efficiency cannot be manipulated just whatever the side government wants to push for today. Understand that even if efficiency is something that is just based on the definition of helping more people, at the end of the day, small charities lose out on this, which is why we feel that the harms on small charities is extremely harmful in today's debate, because we understand that small charities at the end of the day are the ones that actually help these kinds of minorities of the people on the ground better. Reason because we have already told you, it's because small charities are the one with personal connection and are likely to have less bureaucracy and more likely to have an immediate impact towards these kinds of minorities. And next, we've already told you that our trade of today's debate is that although we are benefiting the big charities less, at least we help with the survivability of small charities, because understand in status quo, these kinds of big charities already have enough resources to thrive already. And with that, we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Now to end the op case, I invite the op reply. Here.
Hello again. Can everyone hear and see me?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think side government has given us 3 main things that we want to contend with in today's debate, right? Number 1, effectiveness. Number 2, negligence. Number 3, accountability. First, on the entire idea of, actually no, negligence and accountability, but an idea of negligence and accountability, which side provides better? I say that I think that it's largely going to be a wash, right? Because on their side, they themselves have characterized these current existing, they themselves characterize these current existing charities as individuals, as like organizations that have a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of resources to move around. The point at which they say, oh, let's give us a tax break and people can go in and check and make sure that everything's all right. It's not that different from what the systems that are currently in place in status quo. The fact is that laws, regulations still exist to make sure certain places are up to code, do the jobs they are supposed to do. The only difference in which accountability actually takes in measure is in are they going to do as much as they are going to do, which means that the largest burden of harm about orphanages abusing children, that one doesn't exist in the debate. What we're talking about is how many children can individual orphanages house, and therefore which orphanages deserve the largest amount of proportional reward. The fact that is that we have on our side has given you the proper mechanism in today's debate, which is that if you want to rank charities based on effectiveness, what that looks like is that you're going to rank them based on how much people they can help. Therefore, big charities will always get a larger cut, no matter at how low a capacity they active, because their capacity is always going to be higher than the lowest common denominator charities. Second, on the idea of effectiveness, I think that at best, taking it at their best case, it is still a wash, right? Because we explained to you, right? Even if you can motivate these charities into operating, I argue that it's not any more than they already can. They are already willing to operate because of the fact that you allow them to set their own metrics, to set their own goals for the future, and that is the metric by which you measure them, right? At the end of the day, we ourselves provide you a better mechanism. At the end of the day, because we tell you that no man, the public is there to pressure these charities into action, and henceforth there is a larger degree of accountability, the same degree of accountability exists under our side. Sure, you might say that applies to them also, but I argue that if once the government steps in, then there is no need for public pressure, because people will be oh, the government's handling it, why should we? Right. Second, moving on, right? I think that the largest trade-off that's happening in today's debate is the degree of harm onto which we cause two small charities, which is something that they themselves have very wishy-washy about, right? Some of them at the start they begin by saying, oh, you help small charities more. At the end of the day, they say small charities don't really matter because the burden of harm is less. Here are a few things, right? Number one, understand that you're harming the most crucial minority. Henceforth, it is the worst because you're harming the most harmed people already in society. Number two, you also understand that their case is ultimately one that is predicament upon taking down the most evil people whilst also taking down everyone else down the chain, right? But understand that in their best case, they still do not do much change to the largest charities because they have the reach and power able to hold themselves not accountable to their actions, to buy their way through government agencies, to make sure that their own roadmaps are fit in a way so that they are achievable and can achieve the largest possible tax breaks. And that is the point at which we tell you that small charities do not have the capacity to to do the same things, and henceforth these benefits that they say want to manifest on small charities only manifest on large charities, and henceforth small charities are the most harmed. We give you the impact of that happening in my speech. I tell you why exactly is it that they serve the most vulnerable people, why these people need the help the most. I think that at the end of the day, the response coming from side government is very simple. They say that we rather small charities die than let big negligent people succeed. And at the end of the day, I simply cannot take the degree of harm that they are doing, they're actively choosing to do towards the smallest and most vulnerable communities. So henceforth, please go to side opposition.
And to end the debate, I invite EGAF replies to hear.
I'm assuming I'm audible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. 4 reasons why opposition loses this debate. In doing so, I'll answer 2 fundamental questions. which world has more accountable and efficient charities, and secondly, who has more long-term impact in terms of positive changes. Before this, two technical flaws of opposition that already makes them lose this debate. First is, there's a gross misinterpretation of our mechanism. On one hand, saying legislators choose this roadmap. Secondly, corporations on their own volition decide their own tax break. Thirdly, effectiveness somehow in our world is very rigid. It's only to how many stakeholders you help or how many people you help. All this is not within the line of, firstly, the fiat of us setting the debate and what our mechanisms look like. But secondly, it was very clear when we provided, if you effectively, and I'm sorry that it's bringing a reply, what effectiveness means is that how do you effectively meet the goals of your charity? If you're able to show you that you effectively meet the goals of your charity, that's accountability there. Therefore, you get more favorable tax breaks. I don't know why there's a misinterpretation there, and that harms their case because the comparatives didn't really clash with the meat of argumentation. The secondly is this team was really lacking engagement. Notice how they say we have no mechanisms to help small countries. They don't give us any mechanisms why they should crop out big charities either. They don't give us any counterfactual on how they help smaller charities, and this is crucial because their premise and their assumption is small charities need to survive. But sometimes status quo is not enough to survive. If it's true that small charities are dying as they characterize, how are they going to help the minorities that they stood to protect? How are they going to have tangible changes for their charity goals under their world? Their assumption is they can survive under status quo. At least in our world, when they're not making any form of sustainable change, we tax them higher, and therefore there's active incentive for reformation. But more importantly, we have sustainable changes on how to help them, and there's no other mechanisms in the counterfactual. Two questions. Which one is more accountable and efficient charities? The first thing I want to deal with small charities because this is the strongest argument. And I've already dislodged the premise as to why their case is wrong because they assume status quo is enough for survival. But what are the mechanistic change that we have in order to help small charities? Number one, if they are effective, meaning to say, even if you're a poor charity, but you actively reach your steps of going out in streets and campaigning for your charity, that's a tick in your checklist and in your roadmap. That means you're effectively meeting your goal. Therefore, you're likely to get favorable tax breaks under our world. Secondly, we have an equitable allocation of the tax revenue, meaning to say if you're a poor charity that has already very little funding, our side gives you that form of money, no mechanistic change as to how poor charities get it under their world. Thirdly, we have a database. So let's say in the worst case, you're a poor charity, but somehow you pay a lot of taxes. People can now see, and that's now onus for you as a charity to say, I'm actually trying to do a good by paying high taxes. And now people and actually individuals who otherwise didn't know about a charity, you now have greater airtime because of this existing database. And the airtime wouldn't exist in your world. You assume that they can survive under your world. But if you're unpopular, it's for minority causes that people don't care. What is your mechanistic hope there? But finally, if it's a lost cause panel, that means your charity organizes there's zero change. I don't see why it's okay for you to die out. Because number one, you have no value towards the core principle of a charity of meeting the minorities you protect. But secondly, is that you have no intention to change or reform your ways in order to help those minorities. So I don't think that's something that we need to defend at the end of the day. Secondly, in terms of long-term impacts, we told you powerful entities. They say they have connections towards government. We told you there's competing interests. The evidence for that is Jeffrey Einstein does have powerful connections, but he still went to a legal suit because of his sex trafficking. That just goes to show that even his friends are just 1-2 individual people, but legislators and bodies are at large, and there's competing interest for you to do something. That means we call out negligence, we call out the fact that accountability. WIP says there's some regulations, but it won't work in a world in which governments does not care because they don't have a transactional relationship with you. In our world, there's introspection to make sure you're effectively meeting your goals, introspection to make sure that you're accountable. Judge, if you want to remove all the horrors of the world and truly create a change that charities want to do, we have to make sure they're accountable and meet their goals rather than being complacently taking money and sleeping off the minorities that they stood to protect.
Thank you for that speech. That wraps up the debate. Teams can virtually correspond and shake hands. Congratulations to all. Teams can now leave the room as the judges will be deliberating, and we'll announce the results later. Good luck.
Thank you so much for the debate.
Thank you.
Sorry we didn't take your POIs. We really missed it. Really apologize for that. Thanks for the debate.